get up and running. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the first of a new show, Head to Head with me, Bill Etheridge, and we're going to be going through meeting people with very interesting stories to tell or interesting views, and I'm really delighted that for the first guest I've got on this, and it's not telling too much to say I'm quite honoured that he's done it. He's one of the great men of political broadcasting, very long and varied career, which we're going to go through. I'd like to introduce you all to Mr. Patrick Burns. Patrick, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, it's a pleasure, and very happy to be here. And if this is the first of a new show, then I wish you well with it. And I'm delighted to get the thing launched and underway for you.
Well, thank you. And certainly for me being the interviewer and you being the interviewee, it's something of a role reversal from the last 10 years or so, isn't it?
Well, this is where you turn the tables on me, is you give me a taste of my own medicine. Well, I suppose it had to come to it one day, didn't it?
Well, I think that might be a little bit like a park footballer trying to dribble around Bobby Moore. I don't think that's going to happen somehow. But I think the best thing to do, because obviously viewers in the Midlands will know a lot about you of your recent history doing politics in the Midlands up until your very recent retirement from the BBC. But maybe we should start with your career at the very beginning. So how did the story of Patrick Burns and how you got to where you are today, how did it all begin?
Well, I mean, as always, there's a lot of sort of fluke in this. You know, anybody who, in fact, Ken Dodd used to say, crack this joke, that if you want to hear the sound of God laughing, just tell him about your 5-year plan. The fact is that things map out as they will map out. I mean, okay, it's good to have a kind of life plan, but just have to be prepared to vary things when chances and so on come along. But you may say, well, going back to school days is pushing it, but it is true to say that history was my best subject. But I had a brilliant history teacher, and I remember Tony Blair saying that everybody had a teacher who was a very influential figure in their lives. Well, I had a great teacher called Dave Buttress when I was at King Edward's Aston School in Birmingham. And I was looking at which university courses I should do. And he said, well, why don't you throw in some politics and do politics and modern history? Because he said, you're interested in politics. And I said, yeah, but that's just a bit of fun. It's debating stuff at school and having mock elections, that sort of thing. He said, well, there's no reason why a degree course shouldn't be a bit of fun. So he said that they were brand new, actually, and there was a very good course called Politics and Modern History at Manchester University, which was a very useful and valuable course in its own right, and had an obvious link into broadcast journalism. And it was while I was there that I got involved with a bit of student broadcasting on what was then the Greater Manchester BBC Radio Manchester station. It's called something different now. And I also became quite friendly with a guy called John Waite, who listeners to Radio 4 will have heard of. He used to present a program called Face the Facts, and he became a BBC News trainee. And he said, do you know, if an idiot like me, said John, and he was no idiot, as anybody who's heard his programs will tell you. He said, Patrick, if an idiot like me can get in, so can you. And I followed him in as a BBC News trainee. And as I say, it was a matter of pure accident that politics was part of the start of it. But I did 2 years of basic training with attachments to different regions and local radio stations around the country. And then after 2 years of doing a fantastic apprenticeship, I was always grateful for that. That was way back in 75, 45 years. I served man, boy and geriatric in the BBC. And then I went for you had to apply for a job at the end of that. And the first one I got was quite adventurous, really, if you think about it. It was at the BBC in Belfast at the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And I started off as basically a script writer, a sub-editor in the newsroom, and managed to become a TV news reporter covering the really big news of in an extraordinarily dramatic part of the UK, which is what the fight was all about, really, for both the regional BBC One programme, their equivalent of Midlands Today, and also regularly for network television news. I, for example, covered the attack at Warren Point in the immediate aftermath of the assassination of Earl Mountbatten in August 1979. And within hours of that fatal attack in Sligo, using what was called a booby trap device, which sank the boat that blew apart the boat that Earl Mountbatten and some of his family were on. About 4 hours after that, they used a similar device to detonate a vehicle carrying soldiers near the Irish border, and the IRA attackers were sitting safely on the Irish side of the border, and they detonated this remote control device across the loch that divided the Republic from Northern Ireland, and in the process killed 17 British soldiers and injured others as well. And so I covered what has to be one of the most dramatic days news anywhere. It was very, very difficult to do, of course, but the story has to be got out there, and people have to know the true reality of what the IRA were doing.
And as someone who was there sort of on the spot, I mean, the raw feeling and emotion of the experience must have been something, very different to what we would see through the TV screen. I mean, what thoughts were going through your mind at that particular point as a young man covering these things? I mean, what was it like to be Johnny on the spot in those circumstances?
Yeah, well, Johnny on the spot is actually quite right, Bill. I mean, that was one example where I was actually sent to a story that happened, but sometimes things actually happened in Belfast, just round the corner from where we worked. So I was often Johnny on the spot, literally, because you heard a bomb go off and you ran out of BBC broadcasting house. And what would be going on at the time would be, I mean, the sheer professional logistics of getting the job done in a tremendous hurry would take over. And there was inevitably a certain amount of fear, yes, although I also had some training in how to deal with conflict situations like that. But I think there was one occasion when, and you obviously can't function properly if you allow emotion to take over. But there was one occasion when I heard a bomb. I was in the newsroom, and we knew that a bomb warning had been sent to local paper. I think it was the Belfast Telegraph. So the shutters that we had in the BBC newsroom to protect against blast damage were all shut, and the place was sort of plunged into that, with the nighttime lights on in broad daylight. And we heard the bomb go off, and I ran off to see what was going on. And I was one of the first people on the scene of the explosion in what became known as the Rosemary Street tea room bombing, which was a tea room frequented by the wives of police officers and prison officers who wanted a cup of tea and a slice of cake during their shopping visits to the city centre. But because of the clientele, the IRA thought that the wives of police and prison services were legitimate targets. And I was one of the first people on the scene. And I will never forget the sort of imploring expressions of these ladies who, some of them were horrendously injured. And that was one occasion where emotion really, you would have had some kind of heart of stone not to have been really affected by that. And of course, there was very little that I could do. And at that stage, you did feel that as someone who was there just to purvey the news, it's an important function, but it certainly put my role into perspective when I saw the paramedics and people arriving to try to offer what help they could. But that was absolutely dreadful, and it stays with you for a very long time.
Well, one of the bywords of your career, which we'll talk about later, is the fact that you've always managed to maintain a sort of a professional approach towards things and not really let your personal emotions show through on camera. That takes a very special mindset to be able to do. And I'm just listening to that story. I can't put myself in your shoes and think of what it must have been like to simply just go on camera and talk about it afterwards as a, maybe not cold is the wrong word, but just to be purely factual about it. It must have been something burning inside, the emotions burning at you at that point.
Yeah, well, you have a job to do, and it's not going to help anybody if you become a bit of a wreck. But of course, you go away from that, and when you have time to think about it, you sort of, we are, for goodness sake, human beings, and I can certainly assure you that I felt the full emotional force of many of, not just that, many of the other things that I witnessed. But that was one that stood out, and one that I found particularly difficult to see through, really. But as with anybody who's doing a what you hope is a professional job in trying circumstances, you don't want the pilot of the airliner which is in trouble to lose his focus. You don't want the doctor who's dealing with someone in a really bad way, to take a topical example. You want people to retain their professional focus and do what they're paid to do. And I never lost sight that I had a job to do, which was what I was being paid for. And so that kind of, plus the adrenaline, carries you through.
And as a BBC journalist out there, were there times when the police or the special forces ever said, you guys are in threat and you've got to take special measures to keep out of the way of trouble, or were you sort of left out of the frame on that kind of thing?
Oh no, with that we were very carefully. Our movements were, well. In fact, our movements were closely watched by everybody. So if you went to a security risky event, there was usually a police cordon that, if you weren't literally just Johnny on the spot, as I was with the example I've just given, you would usually be marshaled around. And there were other occasions like the Bloody Sunday commemoration, which is an event that takes place on the final Sunday of January every year, to mark the event which became known as Bloody Sunday, when the paratroopers shot a number of people who they said had terrorist links. That became the source of the Bloody Sunday inquiry. But the net effect was that it was a great Republican parade from Cregan Heights, which is a high point overlooking the city of Derry. And we had to film this procession, and I was the duty reporter this one Sunday. And I can tell you that there the marshalling was done by those people not a million miles from the provisional IRA, who wanted to make sure that the camera positions were the right ones, and that the faces that were going to go on to BBC News that night were not the ones that they didn't want to see on. So being marshalled, I can assure you, came from all sorts of unexpected directions. If you knew what was good for you, you tended to follow those instructions, unless there was a very, very good reason not to, which of course there was the odd occasion when you just actually had to pursue your own best judgment. But more often than not, if you were watching a controlled event, you did as you were told.
Yeah, I actually think discretion would be very, very important in those circumstances.
It was, yes, absolutely. And number one, you've got to get the material back on time, haven't you? So you don't want to make too many waves.
So having been given this experience in these sort of extraordinary circumstances where you started off your career, obviously, I think that will have geared you up to face almost anything going forward from there. How did things progress from that point onwards?
It did give me a certain confidence, I suppose, because when I arrived in Belfast, as I've often said, I joined the BBC just as a recent graduate, so I was a bit of a student, really. I went over to Belfast as frankly a bit of a kid, and I spent 4 years there. And by the end of it, I had really, as anyone who's just been listening to this for the last few minutes will know, that I really grew up, and in the process developed a sort of inner confidence. And what happened next is just one of those things that it's what I was saying about, don't try and predict and plan everything to the nth degree. The way things worked after that was that I was expecting to go straight to London, to television news. I was one of 4 or 5 regular TV news reporters covering Northern Ireland for BBC Northern Ireland and for television news. But I was not at the front of the queue. There were people around who were more experienced and had considerable reputations. And I was the youngest of them. And so, I knew that there were others ahead of me who quite legitimately would stake a claim to the next big job that came up in the television newsroom in London. Imagine my surprise, they say, when I was told that the news editor in Northern Ireland had received a call from his counterpart, the news editor in BBC Midlands. Right?
Right.
And this was because then Pebble Mill, the Midlands staff reporter, whose job it was to cover BBC Midlands and to reflect the Midlands into network news, they'd had one vacancy and appointed someone, and that person had within 6 months gone on to stardom as a sports presenter on BBC Sports. So they'd had the same vacancy pop up just 6 months later, and all the obvious people in the Birmingham newsroom had been tried and interviewed and so on 6 months earlier, and they felt the bosses of the region didn't really want to jump over the same fences again. They felt that they'd selected one good candidate who'd gone, but they were left scratching their heads and saying, do we really want to interview the same crop again? And then suddenly the news editor had a bit of a brainwave and said, do you realize that one of those 4 or 5 reporters we regularly see in BBC Northern Ireland covering the Troubles is actually a Brummie? Really? No, I didn't know that. So my news editor in Belfast said that he'd had a call from the editor in Birmingham with no promises. These are always done by competitive interviews. You know how it works. But would Patrick Burns be interested? And I said to my then boss in Belfast, Robin Walsh, who was a formidable character in his own right, you either sank or swam under his leadership, I can tell you. And I said, well, in a way, I thought my next move would be London, but I know I'm not at the front of the queue. There are much more experienced and very good reporters here who could stake a strong claim. And he made the point, Robin Walsh made the point, that by moving to Birmingham, which at that stage we were at the high point of all the ructions around the Longbridge car factory with Red Robbo and all of that, and then generally as a very big and busy and important region, even though I was less likely to lead what was then the 9 o'clock news, now the 10 o'clock news, I would nevertheless, by being one of one main reporter in Birmingham, actually have an opportunity quite possibly to further my reputation with London in a way that by being one of 4 or 5 very good reporters in Belfast would have been more difficult. So I made a calculation, and as you know, it's a great place to live and work in. I'm not just in the West Midlands, I am of it, like you. I grew up in the West Midlands. It is my home. And so that's what happened. I applied to become the staff reporter and did a couple of years as the main news reporter for BBC Midlands, covering everything from Lady Diana visiting a hospice. I remember was one of. There's a funny story about that, actually. I won't digress for too long, but
no. When you get the stories come up as you're going along, throw them in, Patrick. That's what we want to hear.
Something called the rota. When you're doing a royal visit, you know that HRH will move from one location to another, and you can make a judgment about where you want to put your reporters and your cameras and that sort of thing. And Princess Lady Di, Princess of Wales, major event. She was coming to Birmingham, and we looked at the royal rota. And first, she was going to go to the Druids Heath Community Centre in Birmingham, which, as those of you who know Birmingham will know, is a not the most exciting place on earth. With all due respect, it's in the outer suburbs of Birmingham, and it's a place like most other large cities have. It's a mix of maisonettes and flats and so on, and absolutely no disrespect to the area, but not the most thrilling element on the royal rota for that day. However, later on, and annoyingly close to transmission because it was the last date on it. So the turnaround time was very tight. She was visiting a hospice in Bourneville in Birmingham. And knowing the Princess of Wales as we did, we knew that that was going to be a very, very major event. So I and my cameraman went and got the right accreditation, all the rest of it, to St Mary's Hospice in Bourneville, Selly. And of course, real life being what it is, she arrived a little bit late, so the turnaround time got even tighter. But when she did arrive, it was an absolutely overwhelming occasion because anybody who's ever been into one of these places will tell you that you expect the mood to be absolutely grim, and it's not. They're very often to the great tribute of the staff and the nurses and the support that they get. They are places often of joy, and you know that what the position of the patients is there. They know that, and yet somehow they managed to maintain a mood of such optimism and such positivity. And she arrived, and I was, again, this is one of the memories that you really don't want to obliterate. She was very close up to all the patients, and there was a real sort of element of excitement and, as I say, joy about the whole thing. And so I then scamper back to Pebble Mill and ring the newsroom in London to tell them what I've got. I said, it's absolutely wonderful. We've got the Princess of Wales talking to patients, and it's absolutely magic. And the news organizer in the London newsroom said, but you went to the hospice? I said, yes, Courtney, I went to it's absolutely wonderful. He said, you missed the Druids. I said, Druids Heath Community Centre. all the way through the day, my colleagues in London imagined that the Princess of Wales was about to meet a community of Druids. So my magical encounter with the patients in St Mary's Hospice did actually go a long way to restore their faith in the thing, because it was a terrific piece. But sorry, no Druids today, Bill.
It's quite concerning that people in London think we've still got Druids in Birmingham, isn't it, really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Splendid. I like that one. That's one I'm going to keep in mind to tell people about, especially my friends in London who always seem to not have a clue where Birmingham and the Midlands is. I should say, yeah, hear about the Druids. So yeah, that's great. I mean, and those are the kind of experiences that you must have amassed over your time as the senior guy in the West Midlands, really, and the Midlands area. And so continue your story on, because I want to. Once you've got to a certain point, I want to start picking your brain about certain people you've met and things like that. But let's bring the story up to speed, and then we can go from there.
I will dispense with the next two things in fairly sort of short order, but talking again, this is this other thing about not being too deliberate and too focused about your life's plan, because the best thing that ever happened, or one of the best things that happened to me, was the declaration of war against Argentina over the Falklands. So I've done a couple of years in BBC Birmingham. And I was actually on holiday. I was on a twin centre holiday with my wife in Athens and Istanbul, starting and finishing in Athens, and with a few days in Istanbul in the middle. And when we returned to Athens, we hadn't heard much of news of the rest of the world while we were in Istanbul for a variety of reasons. When we got back to Athens, which was obviously much better connected, the bloke at the quayside, because we came into the Piraeus harbour, said, you are at war. And I said, what? We're at war? What nonsense. I'm on holiday. He said, you might be called up, said this friendly guy. And sure enough, to our absolute amazement, that whole business about, the junta, staking the Argentine flag in the Falkland Islands, has all happened while Mr. Newshand here was completely out of the loop. But what it meant in news terms was that while all the great BBC reporters, including Brian Hanrahan and all the rest of them, were heading off with the task force out to the South Atlantic, and Brian the late great Brian Hanrahan, if you remember, was counting them out and counting them back. The Harrier jump jets being deployed. So I was going to say top guns of the newsroom. Maybe I should rephrase that. But the top guns, the real senior guys, were overseas, and so there was a time when Britain still needed to be covered by BBC television news. So people like me from around the country were brought in to cover Britain, and that was my first taste of working on a network news basis day after day after day, which was terrific experience, and led to me balancing work more and more with going back to Birmingham, but also doing some work for network news in London. And while I was in London, by being part of the swim of things and knowing what jobs were on the go, I knew that the then political editor for the BBC in London, who was the most brilliant, I say brilliant boss, he wasn't really a great manager, John Cole, he of the Northern Ireland accent. Older viewers and listeners will remember John Cole, who made that sort of voice his own. Do you remember John Cole, Bill?
Absolutely, yeah, I do.
Yeah.
He had a very good spitting image puppet as well, as I remember.
He did on the original series of Spitting Image, and he said that too much of the BBC's coverage was done by Westminster Village insiders and correspondents who'd been at Westminster for all these years, and he wanted to get some new correspondents in who had some provincial loam on their boots, back to the Druids Heath thing. And I just happened to be doing quite a lot of work for TV news at the same time that John Cole was wanting to bring a few more provincial oiks like me into Westminster coverage. And so that was my first Westminster incarnation. I joined the lobby. It was 1985 when I was sort of fully up to speed, which was the high watermark of the Thatcher government. And it was absolutely fascinating to see all of that at very, very close quarters. And to meet these figures from that time. I've actually had two really the dominant impressions that I had in the lobby were those Thatcher years, which we can talk about, and then I disappeared and did other things as a sort of producer for a bit, then went back into the lobby in 1998, which was the high watermark of the Tony Blair years. So I saw both the two dominant governments, one on the one side, the other on the other. And then I've seen the sort of the very different politics of governments with small majorities or no majority at all. And now, of course, we have a government with quite a big one again. So it's funny how these things change. But I've experienced the whole thing, So quite a wide range of kind of political weather.
And we'll come back to talk about some of that in more detail, because I really do want to probe a little bit and learn something about those years from you. And particularly, as you might gather, one of my heroes is Mrs. Thatcher. So we'll come back to that. But let's carry on the story and bring us up to the present day.
Well, all right. Well, so there is a gap. I'm a political correspondent at Westminster, doing all the things that I've wanted to do. So I'm reporting from Westminster for National News. I'm presenting Yesterday in Parliament, which was then a very high-profile programme on Radio 4 as part of the Today programme, and interviewing the Prime Minister on the day after the Heysel Stadium disaster, which was a standout moment. All of those stories were just coming my way as a matter of course. And I had some great experiences, appearing live on network television news programs and so on. But we had two little children. Their dad it was before the hours at Westminster were brought into line with human life. So I was going into work at 2:00 in the afternoon most days and not finishing until either very close to midnight or sometimes well beyond midnight. And so the job was fantastic, but the impact on family life in those days was frankly not really that good. Yeah. And we all have priorities in life, don't we? And there was a call came. It sounds like history repeating itself, Bill, but there was a call from BBC Birmingham where they had a vacancy for a very different kind of job. And this same news editor who'd been involved in getting me over from Belfast said, look, you've done lots and lots of things now. You've been in, remember, I'd been news reporting from Belfast and Birmingham, then I'd been a political correspondent. I'd done a variety of on-air news jobs for over 10 years.
Yeah.
And the news editor Midlands said, we have a vacancy for producer on Midlands Today, part of the management team, could be the sort of next stage in your career. And I'd always had a view about producing programs. I mean, on one occasion when I was about to interview the Prime Minister, I had a queue for the 6 o'clock news. I had a queue of radio, TV, all the outlet producers on the phone to me before this was due to take place, giving me the questions that I had to ask for each bulletin or the PM programme or whichever. And I thought, God, am I not, I've got the 4 stripes on my shoulders. I'm the skipper of this thing, and I ought to be able to ask my own blooming questions. When I became a producer, as you will have gathered I did, I became a producer of Midlands Today. I then understood why those producers wanted to get me to ask their questions. It's funny how you see things from the other end of the telescope when you do the job differently. They have programs that they want to construct, and the questions and answers that they want to go into their shows. So I did producing Midlands Today, launching a regional variation of Crime Watch UK, which with devastating originality we called Crime Watch Midlands. And that involved very complex negotiations with the local police forces, reconstructions, all the rest of that. I enjoyed leading that. And I also very much enjoyed leading the development of a new strand of Sunday morning regional television political program. I was the editor and producer of that for several years. And we had some great presenters who I kind of hired. I mean, David Davis, for example, who was a Midlands Today presenter and went on to run the FA for a bit and remains a friend to this day. He was one of our presenters. The late Peter Hobday, who was one of the presenters of the Today programme, actually came from the Black Country originally, from Wolverhampton. He was another of our presenters who I signed up. Yeah. And I very much enjoyed leading that project. But then in 1998, the controller of BBC England said, but mate, you, Patrick, are also a broadcaster. And I'll never forget the quote. He said, if we have the expertise, we should put it on the screen. And it was at that point that the controller of England insisted that I became the Sunday morning presenter, as well as having an editorial role in it, although I obviously had to ease off a little bit in terms of when a program is actually being produced. If you're the presenter of it, you can't do it. It's actually a bit unhealthy and a bit incestuous. I was the sort of strategic leader, but you will know the producers we've had over the years. So we've tended to work as a double act along the way in terms of the way the programs are put together. But I'm very, very proud that I spent the final 22 years of my long career fronting those Sunday morning political programs, as well as covering politics for BBC Midlands Today on television and the 5 local radio stations. I loved doing that. And I'll tell you this, the young man who joined the BBC in 1975 and did all those frontline things as TV news reporting and political correspondent, if you would tell, in national news as well as regional, if someone had told that young man that he would spend 22 years, in middle age and beyond, introducing a current affairs show like that, I'd say, well, that would be absolutely fantastic. Even the young man would love the role that I had on Sunday Politics, or before that Politics show, every Sunday morning doing a live or nearly live show on BBC One, and I absolutely loved doing it. It feels like my career managed to save the best for last for me in a way, despite all the heady things that I did in the early years. It was a great privilege to have the trust and confidence of the public, yes, most importantly, but also when I'd come in on a Sunday morning and I would see the teams preparing the studio and switching the lights on and getting the cameras in position. I remember the very first time I had to do it. and I was about to make my debut in this role, having sort of seen others and indeed hired others to do it. And I got a bit of stage fright as I went into the building. But what you can't do, as you know, is convey to your colleagues that you're kind of just a little bit not sure of whether you're up for this, but you've just got to go in there and
Well,
command the space.
having been on the show a few times, Patrick, you never came across as not knowing what was going on.
Well, I tell you this first morning before the first program had started, I thought I've just got to, even though I was a little bit sort of apprehensive to say the least. And as I walked past the guys who were rigging the lights and they're all up step ladders and things, I found it within myself to say, "Don't worry, chaps, Elvis is in the building." And for quite a while, I was called Elvis. It's like, "Oh, Elvis is in the building. Watch your step." But no, you know as well as I do that however often you've done a television program, and Nick Owen, who's obviously done more TV programs than you and I have had hot dinners, he still gets, you never know it from his demeanor on air, but he still gets pretty keyed up before a program. And I think the day you don't get keyed up is the day that you mess up altogether. I think that constructive being keyed up is a very important part of it, actually.
Well, of course, that was when we met, when
Yep.
towards the last few years of that program, when I was on from time to time to be
You're one of our regulars, Bill. Don't be unduly modest.
a regular troublemaker. Yes, and
well, you said it.
well, yes, I think I appreciated what my position was on the show, and I was normally the guy who would come on with a point of view, and then there would be some banter, shall we say, going on amidst it.
Well, I remember that it was more than banter with Jack Dromey on that one occasion. I was wondering whether, as the moderator, I was quite up to it. But we had our moments.
You did take a sort of referee's presence at that point. I do recall thinking, just for the viewers, there was a little bit of a heated moment with myself and Jack Dromey, where he was taking issue with the way the referendum campaign had been run, and believing that it had led to some hate crimes and prejudice, and I was quite upset about this. And I responded. I thought at the time I was responding in a quite measured way, but looking back at it afterwards and looking at your body language, I think probably it was a good job you were the host, because I think you managed to avert a problem there.
Honestly, I think that a good bit of a sort of clash of ideas is great. Viewers certainly will have loved that moment, and we certainly felt that. I've always loved my politics to be read in tooth and claw. I don't mean necessarily, I'm not talking about political coloration. I'm talking about commitment and passion. And that's always the fascination for me, to have a really highly animated exchange of ideas. What worries me a little bit about where we are at the moment, especially with the role that social media is playing, and look across the Atlantic at events there, in large measure driven by social media. And I really worry that for the sake of our politics, we must maintain our ability to disagree properly. It's one thing to disagree and to hold each other to account as forcibly as possible, but where it becomes as full of bile and hatred and bitterness, and some of the nonsense that I've seen politicians on both sides actually having to put up with, is something that I'm sure you and I would deplore. And it's very depressing to see how the currency is being devalued. And I worry that where is the truth in all this? And is it any wonder that it's becoming increasingly difficult for large sections of the population to work out what really is the truth and where to find it? I would, of course, say that people like you and I know who are the if you like, the gold standard parts of the media, and I'm not just talking about the BBC, and those that should really be treated with a certain amount of skepticism. You go on social media and someone says something, and just because they say something's true doesn't mean it is. This is why we have to have fact checking, and we have to be do the due diligence. As someone said, a lie can be all around the world before the truth has got its boots on and is out of the house. And that is the way of it.
I agree, and we've had a question coming from Marty Kane, which I wanted to ask. It's preempted a question actually, because one of the viewers is asked, "What's the worst change that you've seen in happening news reporting over the years?" And I wanted to just tie that with, as I said earlier on, one of your bywords was always that no one really knew what your point of view was when you were doing an interview. You were always polite, well mannered, but probing with everyone that you interviewed. Now, that seems to have changed with a lot of modern, certainly TV journalists, where they tend to be, expressing their own opinion and almost shouting over the answer. I mean, I think to tie in with Marty's question there, is that something that you've seen? And what's your view as someone of the who I would say is a paragon of the old-fashioned virtues of interviews? How do you feel about that? What's your thoughts on it?
Well, it's very kind of you to say that, Bill, and it is absolutely right to say that all the way through, I made. I just thought it was part of my professional mojo, really, to try and pick my way and help the viewers and listeners pick their way through complex issues, and try to do so in a way which is fair to people on all sides of the argument. So to take I completely understood the strength of feeling that you felt about the European Union, and I felt it talking to. I mean, I remember shortly before the last general election talking to voters in Newcastle under Lyme in North Staffordshire. It was one of those places which became known as a red wall constituency, and I felt the full force of the argument there about the European Union. But I also felt the full force on the other side of someone like we've mentioned Jack Dromey, the Labour MP for Birmingham Erdington, who's got a large Jaguar plant in his constituency. And he was extremely worried about the ability to get those just-in-time deliveries in and out, bearing in mind that you have these supply chain issues where various parts of vehicles are transported back and forwards across the channel before they're sold into markets, including what was then that in the European Union. Now, I completely understood the passion and the power of the argument with which you and he both felt.
Mm.
You were representing the arguments of the people who had elected you, and I may say that I find it very easy to respect those points of view and the people who went with them. And so I think that's why I've done my best to be the sort of impartial, without being too vanilla. I don't think impartiality. I like the word impartiality. I don't like the word balance, because balance implies that it's a completely vanilla, dreary. That if you look for balance, there's no algebraic formula that takes you there.
No,
You know when you are being duly impartial, and that
you,
doesn't
you were you were
necessarily.
never vanilla, Patrick. That's one thing I can say for sure.
but
But
but but
go
I
on.
just do want to say one other thing in answer really to Marty and the things that have changed, and it follows on from what we've just saying. There is that I am becoming, and I think now that I've actually moved on from my formal, quite responsible role, I think I'm able to venture this one opinion. I do find it frustrating when some of my, who are they're now former colleagues, say things like, this feels like a big moment and this feels this or that. And I feel, well, here am I saying I think that it's of no great interest to the public how a correspondent, how a reporter feels about something.
Yeah.
I kind of think my feelings are my own, really. And to say this feels like something, I think is simply overdoing it, and it can be an excuse, in my humble opinion, for saying something for which you don't necessarily have the evidence. And when I went through that wonderful apprenticeship, as I said, with the BBC in London in 1975, where I was tutored by some people who had themselves had long and very distinguished careers in journalism and in broadcasting, TV and radio, that it was almost the mantra that if you said something on air, you had to have the evidence to back that up, and
Yeah.
if you couldn't marshal the evidence to present the argument, the what you were about to say, well, just don't say it. When in doubt, leave it out. And I just feel to say something, well, this feels like a pivotal moment, doesn't really get you there. You say why it's important, you explain the significance with the evidence, and leave the viewer or the listener to decide whether it's a pivotal moment or not.
But of course, they go one step further than that now, don't they? They actually take to social media and tweet out and put their own views on things. You know, some of the things. I mean, you know, we can mention Piers Morgan and people like that. They aren't reporting anymore. They're not asking opinions. They're broadcasting their own opinion. Now, I mean, that is the very antithesis to everything that I understood watching you for many years that you stood for. I mean, there must be some feeling in you about whether or not that's appropriate.
Well, I'll just put it this way, Bill. It's not the way I did it.
No.
I obviously was encouraged to go onto Twitter as part of my profile as the
Yeah.
Sunday morning presenter and as the man on Midlands Today who delivered your political coverage of things like budgets and all the rest of it, and state opening, all these big occasions, and then going to Westminster and covering parliamentary debates for the news and that sort of thing. But And I was always very conscious that people who go to Twitter are always looking for caustic opinion.
Yeah.
And I was also aware that for me, I was only going to say on Twitter the sort of things that I was going to say on air, because I felt it's a public forum. And I think if people, I suspect that most of my tweets were rather disappointing, really, because for those people who were looking certainly for caustic opinion, because I would say if there was a budget day, for example, in however many characters I had at my disposal, is it a budget for jobs? Is it a budget for levelling up? Is it this, that, and the other? I'll be talking to Tweedledum and Tweedledee at 6:30 on Midlands Today. I only used it for things like that. And
In other words, being a journalist.
Yeah. I'll just say that was the way I did it, and I used it as a way of supporting and integrating the rest of the coverage that I was doing on TV and radio and on the BBC's online output.
Okay, well, because we're coming into the tail end of the show, and I've got so much I want to quiz you on, and
Okay.
I'm going to start getting some quick fire stuff in. You spoke about your experiences interviewing prime ministers, and we mentioned Mrs. Thatcher and Tony Blair. A couple of observations about them as the man in the room with them, as the man around them. We witness it through the screen. We read it in the papers. You were there in the flesh. So some observations about the way they handle themselves and their government and their business.
Margaret Thatcher was the first prime minister I interviewed close up. And it was very close up, actually, because it was during those days in Belfast, and she'd only just been elected. And one of the first places she went to was Northern Ireland to make the point that her writ as UK Prime Minister ran in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And I had the job of, she went to the military hospital, first of all, and then I had the job of going in a minibus with some other journalists, following the prime ministerial entourage into Belfast city centre, where she was due to have lunch at a sort of civic reception with Belfast City Council. Imagine, height of the Troubles, imagine what her security detail made of this. She ordered the whole thing as it was coming right into the heart of Belfast, Donegal Square, to a halt, got out of the prime ministerial Jaguar and dived into the crowd. Can you imagine? Yeah.
Wow.
And I thought, my goodness, this is a major moment. And I got out of I knew that the police would put a kind of human cordon around her. And my job was to get out of the minibus and get myself on the inside of that cordon, which I did.
Yeah.
And of course, the RUC were hemming us all in. I had a radio tape recorder over my shoulder, and actually did an interview with the Prime Minister, absolutely jammed in like that, like sardines. And my cameraman, who was in the minibus, took pictures of the interview, because I only had sound, you see, and then married them up later. One of the great sorrows, and so that was the most dramatic, and she registered when it came to it. I mean, I thought, this is my great coup. This is going to go all over the place. she registered just for a moment that I was a bit embarrassed about the position that I was in. And she said, in a actually quite kind way, she said, I think we better just get on with this, don't you? Which took a lot of the tension away from it. So I did this interview. She said, I am the Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and I want to meet people. And, you just have to say that she did that, and to the despair of her security detail. But she lived to tell it. My only big regret is that I was doing a series of lookbacks just before I retired. And because that interview was superseded by a proper sit down interview that she did later in the day, the archive of that interview that I did, the actual talky bits, no longer exist, although there are shots of her hemmed in with the crowd. But it's a great pity that I wasn't able to sort of put that into my kind of anthology of Patrick Byrne's 20 Golden Greats, But that was a pretty dramatic moment.
Yeah. And one of Mr. Blair. Well, there's got to be an interesting contrast. The two big political figures, really, of the last
as I
30,
say,
40 years.
You think of those days that I said in the lobby. I saw the one side, the Margaret Thatcher phenomenon, 3 successive elections, and the Tony Blair phenomenon was the equal and opposite during the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the new millennium. And of course, as political editor, I was reporting very close up to what became the sort of conquest by Labour of middle, all the market shire towns, Warwick, Shrewsbury, Worcester, Gloucester, Stafford, all of them, Warwick, as I mentioned, Warwick, they all joined this great tide of, hitherto staunch Tory stronghold. And I think it was actually the first regional visit that Tony Blair did as Prime Minister was about sort of 2.5 weeks later to Worcester. And that was quite an experience, sort of sitting down to frame up and get everything underway. And Alistair Campbell was sort of floating around, looking in the background like he was trying to make sure that nothing went awry, in a very severe expression of his. And my sound recordist, you'll be familiar with this, Bill, my sound recordist wanted a little bit of sound level. So I just had to ask the new Prime Minister a question just to get the sound check right. And I said, so, Mr. Blair, tell me about yourself. And I'll never forget what he said for sound check. He said, oh. And I thought this was going to be an easy interview. And I thought that was so clever because, number one, it was a gentle put down to me. But number two, and I reflected on this, is that he was saying, I'm not the subject of an easy answer. I'm quite complicated. Tell me about yourself. I thought this was going to be an easy, he was saying that he was quite a complicated figure, which it certainly turned out to be the case, because I know in their different ways, Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair both became far more controversial and still are, all these years after their administrations. And of course, Iraq, in the case of Tony Blair, became the kind of catch-all word that caught a whole set of criticisms of him. It wasn't just about the war. It was about a whole raft of issues that his detractors attached to him under the general banner of Iraq. So he was indeed a much more complex figure than that guy who we saw elected in May 1997 appeared to be at the time.
Yes. Well, I mean, massive contrast between the two characters, I would imagine, although you've just displayed an element of warmth coming from both of them.
Undoubtedly. I got to know Tony Blair a bit before he was elected, and I always found him very warm and friendly to talk to. And he'd talk a little bit about the frustration of coming up from Euston and having to go through the Northampton route, which I'm sure is something all of us who've done that route are grimly familiar with. And the other one was, there was one occasion when I was at fairly short notice about to interview Margaret Thatcher. This is a few years earlier. And her previous meeting was running over, and I was sitting in an anteroom in number 10 with my cameraman and a sound recordist, and the time was ticking along towards getting the recording done for the 6 o'clock news, so it's getting a little bit pressured. And completely out of the blue, the lady herself put her head round the door and she said, I am sorry, gentlemen, the meeting I'm in is running over a bit, but can I organise a pot of tea and some biscuits for you? And she did.
Yeah.
Um, and that doesn't quite tally with the sort of hatchet-faced Iron Lady of popular repute, does it? So, it's often the case when you meet these people, as I'm sure you know, Bill, you find that they're much more human. I remember Gordon Brown, on one occasion, I went to the Smethwick Enterprise Centre just opposite Rolfe Street Station, where a whole ways of teaching young people apprenticeships in bricklaying and all the rest of it was going. And I found him in private to be a very humorous, very personable. We used to josh each other about his support for Wraith Rovers and mine for Birmingham City, which remains a source of embarrassment to this day. Never a good time to be a Blues supporter.
Well,
And
that
so
is
we,
something that you shouldn't have let out to me, Patrick. Being a Wolves fan, I think I might have some fun at your expense at some point
I,
now.
I, I think you've got the laugh on me. I freely admit it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I knew when we agreed to that you were going to come on the show. I knew there wasn't going to be enough time to get all of it in. I knew there wasn't going to be, but we've got a few minutes left, and it's going to be quite apparent to everyone who's seen this interview that Patrick Burns isn't ready to sit quietly in a corner just yet. And I know that you've, as all of us, the lockdown has maybe been a little frustrating for you. Give us a feeling. What next for Patrick Burns? What are we going to be looking forward to seeing you do? Or where are you heading with life? Books? What's coming?
Even though I've left the BBC, I've been given a sort of broad hint that when things return to something more like normal, I will be able to do a little bit of broadcasting again, but under my own terms, rather than the sort of really, really heavy duty work that I've been doing for 45 years. So I have a little bit more time to spend with my wonderful grandchildren, with my lovely wife, who's put up with all the privations of husband being at Westminster or being away or whatever, or even in the early days that I was in that job big in Brussels and Strasbourg, where we had a bigger role covering the European Parliament. This is more before your term as
Yeah.
an MEP. But I don't just want to be a broadcaster. As you know, I've got a wide range of interests in business and public policy generally. And I have got a few little conversations going on, which I will be able to talk about more freely once things do open up a bit. But I certainly, as you say, I don't intend to sort of sit around watching the grass grow. I will have a few projects underway. But until then, like everybody else, I think we've just got to be patient and get on with it and hope that better times come around the corner before too long.
Well, I do hope that when your projects come to fruition, you might sort of grace us with your presence again and give us a little bit of an idea about it. I mean, it has been wonderful, but I can't help but be a bit cheeky now because this is the first chance I've ever interviewed. So I'm going to catch you at the end with a hard question.
Go on.
The world political scene, Trump leaving office, Boris Johnson holding on to a majority, but under immense pressure with the lockdown situation, the economy, and so on. With your experience, where do you see the political scene going in the next few years? I know you've only got a couple of minutes to answer this, Patrick, so I've really copped you with a good one right at the end.
You have indeed. And I think if ever there was a time when wonderful political leadership is at an absolute premium all over the world, we are seeing, particularly in those events yesterday, such a tragic lack of that sort of leadership. And the worry that I've had for some time actually is that you and I both support the principle of democratic government of the people, for the people, by the people. And it's a source of deep, well, tragedy to me that we saw those dreadful scenes at the Capitol yesterday, which have actually, I'm afraid, emboldened those leaders in those countries like China, Russia, North Korea, increasingly Turkey, who think that Western democracy is limping on both legs, that the best days for countries like ours and like the United States and the democracies of Western Europe are behind us. And they will say, well, look at the increasing prominence of these nations which are not open to free and fair elections, and say, well, look, this is what you get when you have an open society. And it's more, I'm afraid, more likely to embolden the Chinese, for example, and all the things we're seeing around Hong Kong and Taiwan, which is a source of really deep anxiety to me, which frankly puts much of the previous stuff we've been talking about this evening into the shadows, I'm afraid.
Well, Patrick, on that relatively gloomy note, but a characteristically honest and
You did
forthright.
ask, Bill.
Absolutely, and you answered. Very well done. I just want to say thank you so much for being on this
Pleasure.
program because
Pleasure.
it is a rare thing to be able to. My first time really doing my own shows and interview with someone who, over the years, I've learned a lot from. When I was a politician in the limelight, I learned from you because the questions you asked sharpened me up no end, and they were always done with that air of impartiality and very serious and very probing. So I want to thank you for what you've done for the people in the Midlands and the country as a reporter over the years. And we want to see more of you, Patrick. And anytime you want to come back on here, gosh, you just give me a call and we'll get you on straight away because we could have done 5 hours tonight. Honestly, this has been an absolute joy and a pleasure. So thank you so much and really want to wish you well and all the best to you.
Many thanks, Bill. It's been a great pleasure, and I have actually enjoyed having the tables turned and talked to each other, as it were, in slightly altered states. It's been great fun, so I've enjoyed it, and good luck with the show generally.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And to everyone who's watched tonight and everyone who might watch when it's shared around, thank you for watching. We will be doing this every week. We're going to be trying to get guests on. Not everyone's as brave as Patrick. Not everyone wants to come on and face the music with me, but I'm sure I'll get them to come and face the music and we'll get some interesting people on. But in the meantime, it's a big thank you from me. Once again, thanks to Patrick Burns. And from Head to Head, it's good night and all the best.